what they good. So I apologize that the book's not academic and that I'm not an academic. I don't have any slides. This is a very simple set of slides that I think I'll have to operate manually to give my overview of the book. I think if I click here, that gets you to the title page. So yeah, as I said, this is a book of history. The rather ambitious, perhaps silly project that I set for myself 4 years ago was to try to tell the history of the 2010s globally. Now, of course, you can't actually do that. So like any history book, it is organized around certain concerns, around a certain focus. And to write this book, I act as if the most important thing to happen in that decade is mass protests that got so big, they became something else. Or mass protests that got so big that they unseated governments or fundamentally destabilized governments. I built the book around that. I built it with 200 to 250 interviews done in 12 countries. And I built it around a certain question, which is how is it that so many of these mass protests led to the opposite of what they apparently asked for? So I'm really grateful to Hassan's here to give you more insight on the most important one, I think, of the decade, which is Egypt in 2011. But that's what this book really is. Now, to start my approach to this topic, I go back to the sociological literature, especially that elaborated by Charles Tilly in the United States. And he comes up with a very important concept, which is the repertoire of contention, which is a metaphor which I think is fittingly musical and theatrical. And looking over hundreds of years of history of what we would now call protests, but really it wasn't protests at the time. He comes to the conclusion that when people protest, they tend to do things that they already know how to do. They tend to draw on existing tactics, existing tools, existing performances, even when something else might be more effective, right? So in moments of rebellion, people turn to what is familiar, even if something unfamiliar might work better. So this is an important basis for my approach to the mass protest idea. Already you're seeing that I diverge a little bit from political projects or narratives that lean into a fully or ultra spontaneous version of political practice. My approach is based on the idea that there's some kind of a lag, that objective conditions change before subjective responses can catch up, and sometimes people do the wrong things. Even if, let's say, imperialism and neoliberalism cause, we can say coherently that it causes, that these phenomena cause a certain eruption. That doesn't mean the eruption will do away with imperialism and neoliberalism.
Can you say that closer to the mic?
You want me to say, oh, there's a mic?
Yes.
Okay.
So I think yeah. Isn't this your
yeah. Where's the mic?
I think now they hear you well. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Good.
It's peaceful, but
right. So to get through another part of the literature review, Mark Biesinger came up with a book which is very important, which has a more empirical approach to some of the same phenomena that I analyze. And he comes up with something called thickened history. And so I use this quote from Lenin, which is maybe apocryphal, but it's too good to ignore, that there are decades when nothing happens and there are weeks when decades happen. So this is, again, the basis for the investigation. But in the 21st century, Biesinger finds, time speeds up even more than that. Decisions are made instantly. Communications devices allow for the reproduction of images and ideas and approaches across the world immediately. And so people, again, are doing things that they already know about or perhaps seen elsewhere when something else might work better. And this also explains why I focus on interviews in the book, because if in these revolutionary moments, if in these moments of thickened history, split-second decisions make all the difference, then you have to pay attention to really what people were thinking and deciding rather than just structural forces, which I tend to find more important in explaining history. But in these moments, I thought it was important to get in the heads of people that were really there. Now, there's the question of mediation. So I'm a journalist, as I said. All I've ever done in my professional life is practice mainstream journalism. And so I put quite a lot of emphasis on the role of media in my account, partially because that's what I know best and where I have a privileged vantage point. I understand subjective conditions, but also looking back at that sociological literature, looking back at what Tilly discovered over years, decades and centuries of contention, it becomes clear that protest never happens before mediation. Protest is always mediated. Now, I don't mean mediation in the sense of someone talking, negotiating on the part of the movement with the government, which tends to be an important part of the tradition of protest as well. But what is found in history is that protest, the power of protest is kind of discovered accidentally through interaction in mass media. Before there was mass media, we didn't have the type of protest that we came to see as natural in the last couple of decades. And so here in the center is Global, which is the classic sort of traditional media. This is a mainstream oligarch-owned outlet in Brazil, which is very important for the main narrative of the book. Twitter, of course, I think it's now X, but it's still Twitter. And then this on the left is an interesting count from Todd Gitlin, who's I think probably not the most important of the voices that recounts what happens with the New Left in the early 1960s in the United States. But he recounts how that movement accidentally discovers the overwhelming power of media without really looking for it, and the overwhelming power to reproduce and intensify and increase the size of protests in the early 1960s. So in my account, there is no protest outside of mediation. The only reason protests exist in the first place is because you count on, either consciously or subconsciously, your message to be mediated and reproduced to at least to the people that might be persuaded to join or to support your mass movement. Now, people that are exactly my age might remember this logo. Does anybody remember this logo? No. Media? Yeah, exactly, in the media. So in the 20th century, at the turn of the 21st century, the anti or anti-globalization movement cemented, I think, brought to maturation a new repertoire of contention that had been, that has its historical precedence in many elements in the 20th century. And indie media produced a new type of mediation that was possible for mass protest, which was happening on the internet. So indie media was an early attempt, very, very anti-authoritarian, very idealistic, to broadcast to the world what was happening in Seattle in 1999. I remember when I was growing up, like, indie media was the internet. How I came of age online was watching what was happening in Seattle through the mediation provided by indie media. So that's all the backstory to the particular repertoire of contention that I think becomes hegemonic in the 2010s. And it becomes so hegemonic that it also often seems to become the natural or really the only way to respond to injustice, to respond to abuses committed by elites. What is that recipe? What is that very specific package of tactics that comes to be dominant in the 2010s? So it is the apparently spontaneous and leaderless, horizontally structured, digitally coordinated mass protests in public squares or public spaces, and often these start to prefigure. Okay. Good. I'm supposed to stay over here, aren't I? Whatever.
No, you can. I just wanted to admit people.
Oh, you wanted? How do I admit people?
No, it's okay.
Did you do it?
Fine.
Okay. And often these were said to prefigure the world they sought to bring about. So I don't want to get way into this now, but in the book I try to at least briefly sketch where all these elements came from. But the point is that they did come from nowhere. They did not spring from the soul of humanity. You can trace historically, ideologically, materially, where all of these approaches came from, and they came together in a very powerful way in the 2010s, specifically because of this image. You could really, if you wanted to, I call this the mass protest decade, you could really call it the top of your decade. You could really tell the story of the rest of the 2010s based on the reverberation and reproduction and mediation of this image to the rest of the world. Hassan has a lot more. I mean, basically, my entire account of it comes from Hassan. I'm not going to speak about it too much. But what happens at the end of 2010 is that there is a revolution in Tunisia. There is a set of mass protests which relatively quickly topple a long-standing dictatorship in that North African country. Now, that happens along more, let's say, traditional lines compared to Egypt. You can identify which civil society organization, which party, which union adhered to the revolution, and when finally the military adheres. The narrative is a little bit more recognizable for those that are familiar with the history of African and Arab revolutions. But then what you get in Egypt a few weeks later is unexpected and unplanned for, even on the parts of the people that put it together. I'm not going to speak too much. But what they do is that a protest on January 25th, which is initially put together in response to police brutality, which does not plan to take the square, nor to do anything but protest police brutality. They did not expect to be able to take the square. They did not even expect to call for the fall of Mubarak, let alone actually achieve it. Ends up 3 days later becoming much, much bigger than anyone expected. They end up going to battle in the streets of Cairo and with the police in the streets of Cairo, and the police lose, the police run away. And what do they do in this moment, right? What happens in this split second where they could sort of do anything is they take the square, and people like me, international journalists from the United States and everywhere else, but unfortunately, the outlets that I tend to work for have the biggest megaphones in the global system. So, U.S. corporate media being the most prominent of the examples, broadcast this image to the world. And even looking back on it now, even knowing how things end up in 2013 in Egypt, I think it's undeniable. It's very easy to understand how inspiring this was. This was Egyptians of every type in the square, establishing new types of relationships across class, gender, religious boundaries. And this inspired quite a lot of other movements around the world to try to do the exact same thing, even if they were in very different national conditions. So by the end of 2011, you have various attempts around the world to do takbir. This was often explicit. So Occupy Wall Street was an attempt put together by Adbusters magazine, which is another important, not relic, but voice from the era of, they're still around, a voice, it was an important publication in the altered globalization era. So Adbusters magazine tries to do Takbir Square in New York. Spain, there's the intentional reproduction of the Takbir model in Madrid. Greece does this to a slightly lesser extent. Chile, you have student protests that explode throughout the rest of the year. And this is interesting, right? Because these are, let's go back, very, very different national and political situations, right? If you think very, very narrowly about what happened in Egypt, eventually the military overthrows a dictator and takes power, promising elections. So in a very, very narrow sense, it's a military coup. One can conceive it as a progressive military coup. This thing does, that kind of thing can happen. But in the US context, it would have been quite strange to hope for the Egyptian outcome, right? But why did this happen? It was adopted because it was incredibly inspiring. This seemed to be the new way to do things. This package worked. You could get lots of people on the streets immediately, basically immediately. Everyone could see an image, a tweet, a Facebook post, and 2 days later, you have hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people on the streets. And this is reproduced in many countries in the first world and throughout the rest of the global system in 2011. But then what happens actually in North Africa? You get an imperial counterattack. You get an imperial response to the so-called Arab Spring, which really shapes the outcome of the uprisings in the Arab world. So in Libya, what happens is NATO uses legitimate complaints, legitimate concerns about the Gaddafi government, legitimate sets of protests as an excuse to launch a regime change operation. It becomes pretty clear that they're bombing the country and the goal is regime change. We all, although a lot of people in the mainstream media in the United States stop paying attention to it, it's the disaster of what comes next has become pretty clear over the intervening years. In Bahrain, you have the Shia majority in alliance with the secular left rising up against a Sunni minority monarchy. And what happens there? Saudi Arabia just marches over the bridge and crushes the rebellion. You have the regional players coming in, whether or not they're global players, regional players, coming in and crushing other elements of the so-called Arab Spring. And then in Egypt, Hassan can talk about this more if he likes, but eventually what you have is a coup in 2013, which is helped to be in that the UAE and a astroturfed petition movement helps to make possible in 2013. So what happens throughout much of the actual so-called Arab Spring is that the final outcome is dictated by imperialist counterattack. But this oddly doesn't change the narrative much in the first world. The Takbir package is still seen as incredibly inspiring and continues to inspire well after 2013. Now you get a second wave of protests in 2013 in Turkey, Brazil, and Ukraine. So the approach of my book, if there is any value in it, The value is that it puts a bunch of different episodes in order so we can see how they're different, how they're the same, how one inspired the next, how certain similarities were ignored or overplayed. The whole point, I think, of doing a book like this is to see how things unfold chronologically. And if we look at the three major mass protest explosions in 2013, you see some quick similarities between the three of them. Now, they end in very different ways, but you see similarities in Turkey, Brazil, and Ukraine. One, they all happened not in dictatorships, but in imperfect democracies, right? So they happen in a case in a situation where someone, whether or not the system is perfect, has actually won an election, right? Two, in Gezi Park, downtown Sao Paulo, and in Kiev, capital of Ukraine, the far right shows up. Now, why do they show up? Because in an extended street battle, people that are ideologically committed are going to show up. This happens in all three cases. This matters a lot in Ukraine, matters a little bit in Brazil, matters much less in Turkey. They end up losing sort of the battle over the square in Gezi Park, the gray wolves that do show up. But in all three cases, they show up. And in all three cases, this was not planned for when this repertoire of contention came together. Football ultras end up having a real influence on the final outcome. Now, again, this isn't planned for, but it makes a lot of sense if you think about it. In extended street battles, who's going to be best at fighting the cops? Who's going to be best at locking arms with people that they've known for a long time and winning a battle over the streets? Football ultras do quite well. And often, strangely, how things end up depending to a large extent on whether or not the football ultras near the capital are left wing or right wing. In Turkey, they just happen to be left-wing. So Beşiktaş and Fenerbahçe supporters show up with hammer and sickle and anarchy flags. Ukraine, famously, the ultras that play a huge role in the final outcome, not the beginning of Euromaidan, are on the far right. And in Brazil, the far right sort of learns what it can do, and it takes a while for the far right to put those lessons into practice. But these are things that pop up in 3 episodes, 2 years after the original wave. So my connection to this story is here. I know Juliana. I was there a few blocks from her on this day, on June 13th, 2013, when the police cracked down on a set of protests that were initially put together by a set of leftists and anarchists in Sao Paulo, the largest city in South America. So this group of leftists and anarchists had been organizing in a strictly horizontalist fashion since 2005, with the ultimate long-term goal of decommodifying public transportation in Brazil. But their short-term demand in June 2013 was to lower the cost of the bus fare by 20 cents, to reverse the rise in the cost of the bus fare. And so they put together 4 protests, which succeeded at shutting down the major arteries of transportation in Sao Paulo, succeeded at getting some attention, but they did not succeed at getting the people or the media on their side. So by the morning of June 13th, Brazil's mainstream media, for which Juliana and I worked, called for a police crackdown. But what happened was, and if the journalistic class in Brazil belonged to the population that often experienced police repression at the hands of the military police, which is a legacy of the US dictatorship, they probably should have known, or they would have known what a police crackdown was going to look and feel like, but they didn't, but they were shocked by what actually happened. So the crackdown that they asked for shocked Brazil's mainstream media. This image became the one that went viral, the image of Juliana, the young, middle-class, white reporter at the mainstream dominant legacy publication in Brazil. And this is what flipped the country. And when I say the country, I mean the country's dominant media and all the people that were very, very far away from the protests, from saying we need to get these punks off the street to saying this is a glorious uprising in defense of the right to gloriously rise up in defense of something. Because they didn't know initially what to say, why it was good, but they flipped from saying this is very bad to very good. I'll go a little bit on, I'll talk a little bit more about Brazil because this is where I was. So when Brazil's mainstream media supplies a new set of narratives as to why this is a good thing rather than a bad thing, I don't think this is planned in a conspiratorial way. The leftists and anarchists that put together June 2013 don't think this either. The government of Brazil, which was the center-left Workers' Party under Dilma Rousseff, the successor to Lula, who's now back in power, they don't think it was a conspiracy. But when the center-right Brazilian media tried to come up with a reason why this was good, they searched quickly their own ideological toolbox, the narratives they could supply, and they came up, unsurprisingly, with center-right narratives. And so very quickly, the people on the streets had very different ideas than the original organizers as to what the protests were about. And 1 week after this day, the day that caused the huge outpouring of support and millions of people to take the streets, what can be clearly seen now is the beginnings of a far-right movement in Brazil violently throw the original organizers off the streets. They are removed from the protests that they started. And strangely, this group, this horizontalist group, the Free Fair movement, is faced with two opportunities that cannot take advantage of because of its horizontalist nature. One, a lot of Brazilians want to join their group. Thousands of Brazilians show up trying to join the Free Fair movement. I saw what you're doing. This looks amazing. Fighting for lower transportation, helping working class Brazilians to get to work. They have no way to integrate the new members, because if they integrated thousands of new members who have a strange and mediated idea of what their group is in the first place, it would mean the diffusion of what the group actually is. Now, if they created a program of cadre formation, if they created a program where we're going to teach you what we're all about, and then like the core group is going to make the big decisions, that was called the Leninist deviation, so they couldn't do it. And at the same time, they were presented with an opportunity, because they did get the 20-cent reduction in fare. They couldn't come up with a new plan. So how do we take this further? How do we build on the success? Because they insisted on full consensus decision-making practices. So every single person in the group had to agree. They couldn't agree. So the far right, within a week, is in a dominant position compared to the people that had originally created the conditions for the surge of support. Now, once we get to Ukraine, by the end of 2013, there are elements which are beginning to repeat themselves from across the decade. So again, you have an unplanned explosion. The beginning of Euromaidan is very small. Not that many people are that interested. There's actually minority support for the European Association Agreement the Yanukovych did not sign. But then there's a crackdown which causes a huge outpouring of support, which changes who's in the street. Outside mediation is really fundamental to the final outcome, because whether or not you're actually near in the capital of Ukraine, or watching Russian language media, or watching Western media, means you'll have an entirely different idea of what's happening in the square, and often like concrete, real responses to Euromaidan were shaped by which television channel or which part of the internet you were watching. To this day, there's really conflicting narratives as to what happened. Again, in this process of mediation, people like me failed to disaggregate, to see that these were historically unfolding and evolving processes. Often from outside, there was the imposition of a single narrative. This is about Europe. This is a far-right coup. Rather than saying that there were three distinct movements in Euromaidan. Again, intervention from abroad. This is something that comes up over and over. Power vacuums created by this type of unexpected mass protest explosion lead to intervention. And then what happens, again, becomes very familiar by now, and it becomes even more tragically familiar by the end of the decade. It is existing elites that enter into the power vacuum and take advantage of the chaos in Kiev, not some sort of new set of structures or new set of, it's not the people from below taking over, storming, and actually taking power. They create the conditions for a kind of game of musical chairs to be played by the oligarchic political class in the country of Ukraine. And then in 2014, you get what is called the umbrella movement. And the reason I'm going to stop quickly on 2014 is that even after what's happened in 2013 with the CC coup in Egypt, the umbrella movement is an attempt to reproduce Occupy Wall Street, which was a copy of Tahrir Square, which was inspired by Tunisia. And this takes place not only in very, very different political and economic conditions, but after the Tahrir model has led to Sisi. After people that were paying close attention to Egypt would have known that it didn't end the way that anybody wanted it to in 2011. Then in the middle of the decade, especially again, amongst people like me, there is a flip in narratives about the internet. People like me started to ask, especially in the wake of Trump's election, oh wait, we thought the internet was only good, is it actually bad, right? There was the assumption back in 2011 that anything that happened as a result of social media, anything that happened as a result of digital coordination was necessarily progressive, necessarily pushing history with a capital H forward. After Trump's election, this narrative flipped entirely. And Ahok is something that will probably be unfamiliar here, but this was an episode in Indonesia where I showed up at the end of 2016 and in 2017, which drove home a set of uncomfortable truths about mass protests and about what had been, how this tactic had been evolving and being appropriated throughout the decade. Ahok was the popular Chinese and Christian governor of Jakarta, the capital of Indonesia. And though he was very popular, the fact that he was Chinese and Christian caused political problems, just like if there were a popular Black and Muslim governor of New York, you could imagine reactionary elements getting very upset about that and trying to find ways to undermine that hypothetical governor of New York on religious grounds. And this is what happens with the 212 movement. And in order to try to undermine Ahok from the right, in order to try to put pressure on to remove a popular governor, they rely on this same repertoire. They gather in the square, they find hashtags, they all wear the same color, they do a mass protest of the type that was made popular in Indonesia, made popular in Egypt in 2011. And this drives, this drives some of the point, which is pretty clear now, especially after January 6th and January 8th in the Brazilian case, that tactics are tools, the internet is a tool, anyone can do this. Anybody can rush the Capitol, anybody can take the square. No protest action or technology is ontologically progressive. And again, what really matters, who ends up really deciding what this means in the case of the 212 in Indonesia is the existing power structure. So what they actually do is they do charge Ahok with blasphemy. There is a manipulated campaign speech that he gives, which is used to make the case that he's insulting the Quran, and he's charged with blasphemy. The reactionary insurgent right succeeds at undermining a popular democratically selected politician in Indonesia in 2017. Jumping forward to 2019, not only because we're getting to the end of the decade, and also 2018 is not as eventful from when you take the very specific criteria for selection that I included. In 2019, you actually have a huge explosion of protests around the world, throughout Africa, Latin America, and Asia. A lot of them get stopped with the arrival of the COVID-19 pandemic. But these two are included because you see some kind of resolution. They're not just stillborn. You see some kind of final resolution in Hong Kong and Chile. And both of them built on something that had started earlier in the decade. And their final outcomes are very, very divergent. In the case of Hong Kong, from the perspective of the protesters, it's a total disaster. In the case of Chile, depending on who you ask, it's a pretty decent outcome. Now, in Hong Kong, very briefly, in the middle of 2019, there are mass protests, which I think it's impossible to deny having a large degree of support from regular people in the country. The numbers are probably inflated a little bit, but there are quite a lot of Hong Kongers that take part in mass protests in June against a extradition bill. And to the extent that the protests can be successful in Hong Kong, it kind of seems to be working. The local authorities take their time in admitting it, but they eventually say, yes, we're going to drop this extradition bill. But as you get in the second half of 2019, is what a lot of the protesters have told me becomes a vicious cycle of hypermediation, where they get further and further away from the regular people that were such a big part of June, and closer to people like me in the Western media. So they told me that they started to do the types of things that would be reproduced positively by Western media, and these were not necessarily the things that were going to be effective in actually acting upon the decision makers who were going to matter in the final case, who all were in Beijing. And so again, this is, I lift this from Cihan Tuyal, who's a Turkish sociologist at Berkeley, who's writing about Gezi Park. But this dynamic is imposed over and over. That the movement cannot represent itself; it will be represented from outside. It will be represented by someone. So while the book and many of the interviewees in the book and myself am philosophically sympathetic to the desire to move past representation, to find some kind of a world in which people are not speaking for other people. What often happens in the decade that I'm analyzing is that representation is imposed upon people from the outside when they came up with no mechanisms of their own to produce it. And then finally, we have, this is Gabriel Boric, currently the president of Chile. What you have in 2019 in Chile is very, very different. You have once more a protest put together by young radicals against the increase in the price of public transportation in the largest city in the country. This goes on for weeks, making life very difficult in the capital, crucially involving the support of unions that make reproduction of the economy very difficult. But what happens is Gabriel Boric, who's one of the leaders of the student movement in 2011, he and other elected representatives of the Chilean people, because he's now in Congress, come up with a deal in Congress to impose some kind of an outcome on what is called estallido social, or social popping, or social explosion in Chile. And they come up with a deal that is to say, okay, we see that a lot of you are asking for a new constitution. We will come up with a solution. We will say to you that the path out of this is a referendum, which will produce a new constitution to replace the Pinochet dictatorship. Now, people on the anarchist or anti-authoritarian left that are in the square, many of them say, well, this is the imposition of meaning on us from the outside. We didn't ask for that. This is people above us imposing meaning upon us. And I think that's right to the extent that meaning can come out of these types of explosions. Every case, at least that I analyzed, in the 10 to 13 countries that I looked at, meaning was imposed from the outside. So I don't think this is wrong. But at the same time, quite a lot of people decided that this was a satisfactory outcome. Quite a lot of people decided to go home after this solution was presented to the Chilean people, and now he's the president. As president, his movement failed to pass the new progressive constitution that they put forward. He's not doing great in terms of his popularity, but compared to the other, very often horrific outcomes that we saw in the mass protest decade, he's a leader of the 2011 student movement that's now the executive. I mean, in the US context, it's like imagining that an Occupy Wall Street leader or an Occupy Wall Street spokesperson may now be the president of the United States, or that, Aaron Bostani would be the prime minister of the United Kingdom. Getting into power, you might not do very well with it, but in the case of Chile, the 2011 movement entered the institutional politics, imposed some kind of an outcome on the estallido social, takes power, and then kind of blows it, if you ask, at least when it comes to producing a path to a new constitution, which is progressive and acceptable to Chilean people, they blow it. That's the game, I think, you try to get power and then you might misuse it or you might do okay. It's, this is the long game of politics. So I've already hinted a lot of this so far, but this is kind of my best attempt to explain what happened. This book doesn't try to provide any answers as to what to do, but the answers that it does try to provide is to the question, what happened? So what I believe happened in some sense is that in the mass protest decade, one very specific repertoire of contention proved very effective, more effective than planned for, at getting huge amounts of people onto the street. Often, enough people poured into squares or public spaces to actually generate a revolutionary situation, including in many cases, if I'm not the only talk about this, when this was considered unimaginable just weeks previously. But a protest, especially this type of protest, which often consisted of millions of individuals with a million different ideas as to what it was about, what the outcome should be. They often didn't know each other. They were often just saw the same post on the internet. A protest of this kind is very poorly suited to take advantage of a revolutionary situation. And what happened over and over is that it was existing elites, existing organizations, imperialist forces that recognized the power vacuum and stepped in to take advantage of it, rather than the original organizers of the protests themselves. So depending on how big and how crazy things got in different moments in the 2010s, there might have been the possibility for proper revolution or for reform. It's not my job to decide whether it's the future of humanity what's the right path forward. But in either case, this does entail, at least in every case that I've seen in recent history, some kind of representation. Either someone needs to go in and establish a new revolutionary government. If someone's going to seize, for example, the television station, as might have been done in Egypt, and broadcast a revolutionary message, that would have necessarily required deciding who was going to be on the editorial board, what was the message going to be, and so on. So representation again becomes necessary, even if philosophically we all might like to move past it in the final analysis. And then often what happened, actors replicated tactics that they had learned beforehand in key moments. And tragically, they considered protesting when there was no one even left to listen. Like the protests continued when there was no one to protest to. It was now time to like build in the society, and this transition proved very difficult.
You have 5 minutes.
I am almost done. Yeah, cool. So in these moments, the future was often decided by who was willing to enter the power vacuum, who already knew what they wanted, whether it was NATO or the far right, or Gabriel Boric in Congress that, you know, in a very politician-style way, came up with an agreement behind the scenes to impose a meeting on the uprising. So another conclusion that I come to is that this particular form, the apparently spontaneous, leaderless, horizontally structured, digitally coordinated mass protest, is best suited to movements that are pro-systemic. And this is in the world system sense. Best suited to protest movements that are basically saying to the global system, yes, come in, fill the vacuum that we've created. We want the existing power structure to take over what is happening here. Now, so this makes sense in the case, actually, a lot of what happens in this book is about misunderstanding what actually happened in 1989 and 1991 with the fall of the Soviet Union, Warsaw Pact countries. But in the case of East Germany, if you did just want to become West Germany, that works. What happens is you create the power vacuum, DDR falls apart, West Germany is sucked in, pours into the power vacuum with investment, with government structures. The world system in the case of in the case of East Germany, not a lot of people actually wanted that. That's to expect something very different to happen. But if that's what you want, then this particular form is well suited. But if you're actually challenging power structures, if you want to reconfigure the global system, if you see yourself as challenging the regional or global structures of the world economy, of the world's military alliances, then a revolution is going to mean a counter-revolution. It's going to mean a counterattack. And over, tragically, in the 2010s, this type of protest movement failed, inadequate at beating back the counterattack. The counter-revolution came and often won. So that's how I end up summarizing what I think happened. Very, very quickly at the end of the book, I gesture vaguely at return to something called, that what a philosopher Olufemi Taiwo calls constructive politics. The idea that the future must be built intentionally rather than something that will arrive in a messianic or eschatological sense that we can just sit and wait for the break to come. And I point to a lot of theorists who, as I said, this is a book written by a journalist through interviews. I point to some of the books that I draw upon who grapple with this question theoretically looking towards the future. But that is how I understand what I think happened in the 2010s, and these are some people that are thinking hard about how to move forward in the 2020s and beyond. So thank you very much for listening.
Thanks. Thanks, Vincent. And also thanks for writing this book, which I think really filled in quite an important gap. To be honest, I have never seen such a kind of presentation of the 2010 decades of revolt in such a comprehensive way. So this is surely very important. And as anticipated, we will now collect questions and comments, starting with Hossam, who's at home. So Hossam.
Yes. Being interviewed for this book was very exhausting, I have to say. Vincent goes into details and the details of the details in order to draw this accurate picture that's full of color in the end. But having said that, I mean, I still enjoyed very much our interviews, not just because I love to speak about myself, also because Vincent, for me, he validated and still validates, of course, an ideal or a model which I felt that I've been fighting for in most of my career. I'm also a journalist and I worked for mainstream publications. One of them was the Los Angeles Times, where Vincent also used to write for. And from day one in my career, I always had very tense relation with my editors because they would accuse me of being an activist, not a journalist, and they would accuse me of being not neutral enough. And we would get into all of these debates. And what I was trying to argue for is that there was a different kind of tradition of journalism, which it's not propaganda, but it is a different kind of professional journalism in the tradition of John Reed, John Pilger, Paul Foot, where you get to prioritize certain stories, where you fight to clarify a narrative. And I think that's what Vincent has been doing in this book and his other works also. And I just want to stress two quick points. Speaking of the narrative, the first one is related to the square. And as Vincent brilliantly actually described, the visuals from Tahrir, it inspired movements around the world. And rightly so. Definitely what happened in Tahrir was epic and heroic. And I'm very proud of our role in Tahrir. But I think that revolutionaries in other countries have drawn the wrong lessons because it wasn't us in Tahrir who toppled Mubarak in the end. What toppled Mubarak was the mass strikes by the workers, which took place during the last week of the 18-day uprising. If it wasn't for those mass strikes, I think Mubarak could have survived in one way or another, our Tahrir sit-in. It's only when Tahrir was taken to the factories and the workplaces that actually the army felt obliged to depose Mubarak, or else the whole system would have collapsed. The second and the last point I want to make, our revolt in Egypt, and I think I can generalize about this in the Arab world at least, was depicted in the West as purely a struggle for democracy by internet savvy youth who are bilingual, sporting BlackBerry, internet savvy, and they can use Twitter and Facebook. And what they are fighting for is to have more McDonald's and more Starbucks, you know, I mean, in their cities. But at the same, I mean, putting that caricaturish kind of narrative aside, there was an anti-imperialist component to our uprising and our revolt. And trying to dismiss this was a very dirty game by the Western media and part of the scholars community also in the West. After all, the 2011 uprising in Egypt was the climax of a long process of dissent, which started with the second Palestinian Intifada in our region. And the Palestinian cause has always been the major politicizing and radicalizing factor for Egyptian youth. And it's our gateway into politics. And that includes myself, includes many of the leaders of the revolt, and many of the activists also community. And these are the kind of narratives that actually Vincent puts out there in a very elaborate but very understandable and very colorful language. Hence, please go and buy his book. I definitely recommend it for everyone.
Thank you so much, Hossam. And I'm now going to collect a few questions. So please raise your hand if you want to ask a question, make a comment, both at home and here. Yes, I see one. Bit more, some women. We start. Okay, so we start with you in the back, then you. Yes. Okay, we have a few. So we start with the. If you could please introduce yourself, and actually, would you mind coming here because people at home can't hear? So maybe would you mind, please? And in the meantime, she will come here. Okay.
Is it okay if I'm loud enough?
Come. Okay. Careful, don't walk on that. It's King's, guys. This is a King's experience, 100%. Yeah. Okay. Okay. Great. Okay. So please introduce yourselves and.
Hi, I'm Roanna. I use they, them, and I'm a student here at King's. What impact have you seen art have in mobilizing people? Obviously, it's easier to share pretty images on the internet, a nice, clean infographic than just like a time and a place. How do you think, I know that I'm aware of punk music in Tunisia having like a surge in the early 2010s. What impact has art had on mobilizing people, and how can we use that today?
Thank you. Thank you. Yes, please. I mean, if the people who want to come and speak, I collect 5 from here and 2 from home, and then we'll have another round. Yeah.
Yeah. I'm Devika. I'm a lecturer here. I finished your book. I thought it was really great. Thanks for writing it. I had a few questions for you. I think I really like the idea of sort of mediation for what the protesters wanted and all over the world, specifically the role played by social media companies, which you like repeatedly point out is a very specific version of social media based in the US, in Silicon Valley, run by what we should be calling them as oligarchs. We just don't, but because they're not Russian. So what I'm wondering is like, one, is there a way forward you see for social media? I know that's not, you kind of just said it's not your job to decide the future, which it isn't, but you know, we can hypothesize. So I was wondering if you have a hypothesis about how do we proceed? Because, you know, even I'll shut up very quickly. Is that like, even if you think of nationalizing them as public utilities, the imperial dynamic would still work, because I don't trust the government of the United States of America to have anybody's interest, you know, a public interest in mind, especially like a international public interest. And I guess the other sort of maybe more provocative question is, does it suggest that anarchist or horizontalist tactics would no longer work in this day and age? Because it suggested from your book that outside of like union built movements and existing Marxist-Leninist movements, right, in those contexts, a horizontalist sort of approach has only kind of led to, as you put it, the opposite of what the movements wanted. So yeah, I would love to hear what you think. Thanks so much.
Thank you. You want to come next? Yes, basically people from home can't hear you from there. So if you want to ask a question, I'm really sorry, but you will need to come on the podium. So I see you, and then you asked, yes, you raised your hand first. Yes, please go ahead.
Hi, my name's Clarissa. I'm a student here at King's, and I'm Chinese Indonesian, so your Jakarta method book really hit home, and like the ad hoc stuff being really amplified. I was wondering if you had any advice for someone like me who's working on my own platform to tell the story of, you know, Chinese Indonesians and how we have little to no genuine representation in media. And yeah, I would really like to know, because like just reading the book itself, it's a bit of a shame that no people of my own have made such a like insightful narrative of our own history, and it had to come from an American man, and it was great. No offense, it was eye-opening. I loved it. Yeah, I was just wondering if you had any advice. But thank you.
Thank you.
I'm really scared to.
Next round, yeah? Yeah.
So good evening. My name is Jad Al-Haddad. I come from Lebanon. And quite honestly, when I saw this is not related to my question, but when I saw the 2019 protest, I wish that you included the Lebanese one that started on October 17th. It's what by far the funniest protest you could ever see. I don't know if you guys followed up, but when we were down on the streets, we had pools like gonflable, those that you inflatable pools with water. It was like the funniest protest across the globe in history. You can check some videos. It was very nice. Anyway, my question is a bit more pessimistic. So even though I know that now we do know the end of the story, and we do realize, if we look retrospectively, many of the Arab Spring revolutions, I'm thinking especially in Libya and in Syria, these two countries, before the revolution, I do realize that they did not have that a huge amount of rights or freedom. And I do realize that us as humans, we aspire to have these. But now the situation in Libya that's torn in civil war, and Syria that is still divided, where we've seen terrorism, where we've seen international meddling in the Syrian things. Yeah, so the civil war that's happening there, that's still ongoing till today. I believe if you go to these places, they might regret going through these revolutions. So these protests, because before the revolution happened and took place, most of these places did not have freedom of expression, but they had at least good standard of living, because of, even though these were autocracies, but you had many rights, right to education, free of education, and now you have these torn countries. So did you assess, or were you in contact, and what's your opinion, especially if you talked already to people who actually regret going through their revolutions? Sadly, we know now the end of the story, but while going through them, it's understandable that they went through it. But what's your opinion? Thank you.
Thank you. What's your name again?
Jad.
Jad. Okay, thanks, Jad. Yes, you're our final from here, and then from home, let's see how many.
Can I answer them before we take more? Because I'm gonna lose my.
Okay, let's go.
Yeah.
Okay.
I'll do a set of answers, and then I can.
It's kind of a bit of commentary and a question as well. And my name's Theo Thorgore in Greek. Yeah, these were all protest movements, but I think a lot of them had very different aims and objectives compared to other ones. So if you look at what happened in Syntagma Square, for example, in Greece, I mean, a lot of the protesters wanted Greece to, if not reject the European Union outright, they were extremely critical, especially of its economic policies, laissez-faire, economy, etc., etc. Whereas in Ukraine, if we look at another country, quite the opposite. They wanted their country to join the European Union. And I remember in Greece, you know, some people sort of scratching their heads and thinking, you know, what's going on here? You know, we want to, if not leave, certainly much more critical of the European Union. And also, yes, this sort of notion of mainstream media, I would just call it a right-wing media, really, because that's what it is. It's a right-wing media. So my question really is, yeah, you can say there were similarities, but the differences between the different protest movements in different countries, really, that's the question.
Can I start?
Yes, you can definitely.
Okay, thank you so much. I'm gonna stand here. Thank you so much. Try to remember the 5 things. So first of all, the question was about the role of art. in spurring people to get to the streets. And you mentioned punk rock in Tunisia. So I left this out of the talk, but almost everybody in the Free Fair movement in Brazil was part of the anarcho-punk scene. So punk had not only brought certain anarchist trains of thought into Brazil, but really had a lot to do with certain organizational practices that were common in Brazil in 2013. The role of art is and has been essential part of the story in most of the mass uprisings that I can think of, whether it's on the walls, whether it's some kind of an image, some kind of an infographic that gets people out there. But what I found as the dominant thing that set the spark, that really got the explosion going in the 2010s, in the majority of cases, was not something that was positively inspiring, but something that was shocking and outrageous. So when I think 7 out of the cases that I look at, so that's the majority, it was the viral image of police repression that became the iconic image, the thing that got people out there. And people who have studied social media more empirically have come to the conclusion that across the board that moral outrage is the best driver of engagement on social media. So these platforms are now actually constructed to keep you as outraged or jealous or unhappy or somehow angry as possible, because that's going to keep you on the platform for as long as possible so that they can show you ads so you can buy other things. And then finally, the arrival of sort of, let's say, Instagram story politics really starts to matter by the end of the 2010s. In the early 2010s, it's a lot of things, discussions that are hammered out on Facebook. By 2019, 2020, Chile and the US, it's often like Instagram infographics that really power to the extent that there's discussions over strategy. They're taking place on a platform where you can't even have a discussion, at least in Facebook back in 2013. Like I remember decisions being hammered out in the comment section of the Movimento Passe Livre Facebook group. By 2019, 2020, it's just like everyone's posting, whatever, Square or the infographic. And this made decision-making over a collective course of action even more difficult by the end of the decade. You asked 2 questions, both very good. My answer to the first one is very simple to say and very hard to do. I think that oligarchs took the internet away from us. We have to take it back. There's no easy path to doing that, as you say. I do think that somehow or another existing states have to be involved. But there's the problem of the fact that the state that governs the territory with all the infrastructure is the United States. This is a very difficult problem. I think that the best thing we could do is build a long-term project of international cooperation to sort of try to deprivatize the internet, to bring it back into collective control. Because there's a point I've been making often. The oligarchs in the Russian context were people that seized assets that had been constructed collectively by the people of the Soviet Union for 100 years through toil and suffering and struggle. Our oligarchs also seized public assets. The Mark Zuckerbergs and Peter Thiels and Elon Musks of the world took away from us the product of public investment and decades, if not centuries, of technological and scientific progress. So it's very hard to do, but I think we have to try to take it back. And I don't think we can do it tomorrow. It's going to be one of these building the future type long-term projects. Now, the question of horizontalism is a big one in the book, and also as you pose it now. So to try to start to answer it, I will make the distinction that I didn't in the talk between movements which were self-consciously horizontalist, which was the case in Brazil. They believed in horizontalism as a practice. They believed that it was the right way, the best way to carry out political change, to structure a social movement, and other movements that were more concretely horizontal. So you have horizontality, which often appears as the concrete result of the decimation of left-wing structures, union organizations, all of the types of organizations that could have responded to injustice in a different way. So that was often more the case in the Arab context. Not so much that the leaders were horizontalists, but you had concrete horizontality. And often what was sometimes, I think, a weakness was read as a strength by outside interpreters, by people in the media, by people, some people in the square who said, yes, this is a positive thing. but it was often what is sometimes a weakness was seen as a strength. And it was often, I think, this really matters, the precondition for the positive, that vicious cycle of positive media reinforcement that made them big in the first place. Because in many cases, if the outside world, obviously always receiving the information about the square, the protest, mediated through social or traditional media, if the outside world perceived something to be spontaneous and leaderless, they could easily believe what they wanted to about it, and this was much more likely to lead to positive representation. Whereas if you had somebody, let's say, in some imaginary Arab country, someone says, "Oh, we are the revolutionary social democrats. We are Marxist and secular." This would probably scare many people in the global media, and it would be much more difficult to get this kind of a vicious cycle of positive representation. So, So it's a big question. So in the long term, I think that concrete horizontality is not going away. There are going to be masses of people that are coming out into getting politically active for the first time, that are not part of some organization, and even the most structured and bloody-minded and vertical, let's say, revolutions throughout human history have relied upon that type of phenomenon. I think it's going to be a feature of the future, and trying to will it out of existence is a mistake. But I think that also what is shown, at least in this very, very specific set of cases that I look at, which is a mass protest that gets so big that it becomes something else, movements that are only horizontal, that have no one willing to enter to step forward, hopefully democratically selected by the people, hopefully with the assent of the people, the movements that have no one that are a little bit more structured and organized and willing to take a step forward tend to lose out to other movements that will. So I think that depending on what you're doing, this can be more or less useful. And in my case, it was very useful at getting to a certain point, but not useful at walking past it. This is a very good question about building narratives outside of those that have already been made possible. And so what I would say again is that we can't wish ourselves out of a world in which for example, we can't wish ourselves out of the world in which, for example, I'm given opportunities to have a media voice that somebody that's born in Central Africa would just never have, right? So this is the unfortunate precondition for all of my work. Often my work is about the creation of this global system, but also is published into this global system. So as long as media is going to continue to be important, and as long as narrative construction is going to be required for the way we understand our world, what you put forward, the idea of you building a voice, building alternative narratives, doing your own work, I think is essential and should be encouraged as much as possible. And again, it's hard. It's very difficult to build new and independent media sources now, but I think it's an essential part of the overall package. So I thank you for that question. Yes, not only in Syria and Libya, but even in the most even in Tunisia, a bunch of people said, "I wish this never happened." And that's tragic for me. I think that hopefully I can, Hassan might also hope to look forward to a world in which 10, 15 years down the road, people look back and say, well, actually, no, that was the beginning of a larger victory, that I'm glad that we started on that path. But a precondition for this type of investigation for this book is the tragic, unfortunate, I wish it weren't true reality that things can get worse. No matter how shitty a certain government is or how bad an economy is, you can imagine it getting worse. And in some cases, people explicitly in my book said, it can't get any worse. And then it got way worse. So I wish it weren't true, but people told me that they did feel that way. And then, Theo from Greece. Yes. So a major part of the book is explaining the ways in which movements were different, and those differences were elided by either media representations or sometimes the participants themselves, whereas the intentional reproduction of tactics created a similarity, which maybe you would have wished not to see. Maybe you could view it as an error. But then the very, very different political and economic structures, the very, very different goals were often ignored because they looked the same. Oh, you got a lot of people in the square. They're all doing Tahrir Square. Oh, everyone's in the square. They're all doing the fall of the Berlin Wall. And yeah, Greece and Ukraine is an interesting contrast, although I will say at the beginning of Euromaidan, a majority of the Ukrainian people didn't want that association agreement with the EU to be signed. It was often later that narrative was imposed from outside because it was actually a police crackdown that got people in the streets after the first few days of protesting in Ukraine. Okay.
Thanks so much. Can I see more hands up? 1, 2. Simona, do you want to intervene? Okay. So 3. Okay, so I see Alex Kallinicus, who is one of the co-organizers. So Alex, you will next, since you have had your hand up for a while, and then I will ask also Tanvir, and then people here in the room. Go ahead. Alex.
Okay, thanks very much for a really interesting presentation and for a great book, which helped to explain why the 2010s were such an exciting, but also such a disastrous decade. Not as disastrous as the 2020s, but never mind. And the conclusion that you draw, not quite as explicitly now as you did in the book, that crucial to who shapes a particular movement is who has pre-existing political organization, is music to the ears of an old Leninist like me. But I've got 2 criticisms of the book, which I don't want to make which don't contradict the huge strengths of the book, but that I think are relevant. The minor criticism is that you don't really say enough about the anti-globalization movement of the 2000s, which in many ways were the incubator of horizontalism. The ideology and the practices of horizontalism were largely developed there. They produced important international mobilizations, but they failed to develop strongly at the national level. That's one of the differences with the 2010s, but this seems quite an important moment. That's the minor criticism. The major criticism is that the first chapter on the 60s is really weak, to be absolutely honest. I mean, to make Todd Gitlin the main analyst of the movements of the 1960s just doesn't cut it, because this hugely underestimates the scale, the social depth, the range, geographical range, and the relative success of the movements of the 1960s. I mean, it's true that in 68, they didn't achieve the revolution they hoped to in France, a bit later in Italy. But nevertheless, if we want to look at the kind of social reforms, particularly when it comes to movements against oppression, that in a way we've been living on since then, those movements, the movements of the 60s, are absolutely critical. And there wasn't the kind of right-wing deflection of the movements that you analyze so well in the case of the 2010s. Why is that? Critically, it's because the organized working class and the organized left were much stronger in the 1960s and early 70s than they are now. And that meant, partly in a negative way, the established left-wing parties could absorb a lot of those movements and kind of deflect their aspirations into relatively limited goals. But it also meant that if you wanted to carry it on, you know, it's only a start. Continue the struggle, they said in France in 68. If you wanted to continue the struggle, you participated in the organized left. Now, maybe in a new form, a Maoist or a Trotskyist group or something like that. This is an enormous difference from what happens in the 2010s. I don't particularly want to big up the 1960s. They're all negative things about, of an in-depth comparison with the movements of the 1960s, which had their own forms of mediation with radio and TV and so on and so forth, all sorts of things that are parallel with the movements you're talking. But the absence of that in-depth comparison, I think, weakens the explanatory power, because there was a vacuum, which is partly the effect of the failure of the movements of the 2000s, of the anti-globalization movement, which helps to cushion failure of the movements of the 2010s. Anyway, I'll leave it there.
Okay. Thank you, Alex. Do you want to come, Yuara? Sorry. Fraser, come. Yeah.
Hi, my name's Fraser. I'm a PhD student at Warwick University. My pronouns are they, them. I was wondering, I think you've kind of started to touch on this already, but I was wondering kind of how your theoretical conclusions might differ from a straightforward Leninist critique of these movements. Is it just a question of the absence of an effective Leninist political party or organization in these contexts? Is there a kind of limit that existing Leninist organizations have across these different contexts? And kind of maybe how this relates, therefore, to like Rodrigo Nunes' neither vertical nor horizontal, and his kind of like network Leninism.
Thank you. Can we collect 5?
Okay.
Again,
Can I speak?
You come next. Yeah, come here, and then I call Tanvir. Yeah. Sure. Yes. And yeah, come here. Come here.
Or other end?
Yep. Yes, other end, so they can see you maybe.
Sure. This okay?
Yes.
Yeah. Hey, Vince, long-time listener, first-time caller. Reed from New York. I teach political theory at University of Essex, just outside the county. I want to kind of continue to push the kind of distinction between horizontality that's already been brought up. So I'm wondering maybe if you could talk a bit or reflect on distinction in kind of the political logics of horizontalism, the tactics of symbolic representation from maybe other political logics like populism, Moinism, whatever. And if these are tied to, or maybe not as efficient for modes of political success that you're thinking about. So, I mean, I have colleagues who do political theory on horizontalism who will tell you the goal of a horizontal protest is not to have a spontaneous revolution, but to do kind of instrumental discursive change that'll, pave the way for further change. So I'm wondering if, maybe there's an implicit normative idea about what political success looks like, right, and how that informs your critique or your analysis. And then maybe one analytical suggestion would be, maybe, and this is, my idea, you can tell me if you disagree with me or not, that we should think of discursive counter-reactions from the media or whatever as independent autonomous phenomenon from the actual modes of protest. I mean, I'm a populism scholar. We see this a lot now of discourses of anti-populism. It doesn't matter how well you brand yourself, the messaging of your movement. It seems the media is gonna, go after a Bernie Sanders or a Mélenchon in France as kind of this demagogue, anti-egalitarian figure. So thanks for the book. Looking forward to your responses.
Thank you. Okay, do you want to come next?
Okay.
Yeah. Do you want to come here?
Yes, I think
Okay.
I'll probably go through that. Yeah. Hi, my name is Aravind Ganesh, and I'm a lecturer in law at the University of Sussex. I read this book with very great interest because I read your first book as well, and I'm from Singapore, which is not far from where the events happened, and because this book was of great interest to me because I was living in New York at the time of the Occupy Wall Street movement, and my job was basically defending the big banks that destroyed the world economy on precisely the stuff that destroyed the world economy, I used to walk down to, I had these moral spasms and walk down to Gezi Park to watch to join in, to see what, because it was an exhilarating time. And when I look back at the crowd, at my memories of these events, like I don't want to trade in lazy stereotypes about the fashion choices or things like that. But I'm pretty sure that a lot of I had this strong hunch that a lot of the people there who took part in the Occupy Wall Street movement have now sort of moved on to anti-vax, QAnon, rather than horizontalism. The new drug is diagonalism. So I'm wondering if you'd had any opportunity to speak to people like that, this sort of who might have rather than the movement being compromised from without, that the participants themselves might have changed over time. Thank you.
That's fine, right?
Is it?
Yeah.
Well, you didn't have Tanvir. Tanvir wasn't really a question.
I'm here. Okay, yeah, one more. Do one more.
Yeah. Can I ask a question? Can I put myself in?
Yeah, please.
Okay, so I just wanted to go back to the points that Hossam made at the beginning, right? So the question of the mass strikes and the question of anti-imperialism, because of course we are holding this seminar today in the middle of a genocide that is going on in Gaza, right? Which I think really puts the question of anti-imperialism and international solidarity with the people who are, affected by Western imperialism, from Gaza to Yemen, etc., really at the center of our attention. And I think it's also great to be holding this meeting in the middle of a global movement in solidarity with Palestine, because of course we need to, solve the problems of the previous decade, maybe in order to build a stronger movement that can really bring the whole thing down now. So when I was teaching IPE for my students, I was actually looking for a video that could show the connections between Wall Street, Occupy Wall Street and Egypt. And I tell you, I didn't find anything I could use as a resource for my teaching. And then if you look at the kind of Occupy Wall Street movement and the kind of reconstructions of it, there is very little acknowledgement, right, of how much they borrowed, but even the anti-austerity movement, how much they borrowed from the movements on the other side of the Mediterranean. So this part has been kind of erased in our kind of collective memory, I think, in Europe, also because I think the solutions that prevailed were quite reformist, right? Even the anti-austerity movements, so this Syriza and so on, that ended up actually being kind of important players in the kind of European imperialist war machine, and also in the control of, the European borders and attacks on immigrants, etc. So I completely agree with you, and as being grown up in Venice, where the autonomists were kind of hegemonic and beat up most of my friends. So I was really happy to see all your critiques of the autonomists and Negri, etc., really made me filled with joy. But I was also so I agree that the question of representation and political organization is key, but I was also wondering whether the question of anti-imperialism and international solidarity with people who didn't just have to organize, like in Libya, maybe develop their own organizations, etc., but also had to face the entire Western war machine, like with NATO, etc. So how, this other part maybe needs some reflection today, when I think the question of solidarity with the people who are affected by our own governments is central to building the solidarity movement and maybe a revolutionary movement here.
Okay, that's fine now, right?
Yes, fine, yes.
Okay, try to keep all this in my head. So number one, both of Alex's critiques are correct to the extent that there are a lot more things in the alter globalization movement and the 1960s that I include in my book. The reason for the selection of the things that are in the book is that really this is a prehistory of the 2010s and that particular package of contention. So I just pick and select things which end up recurring in the main narrative. Everything that happens beforehand is really just kind of prefiguring the main narrative. So in the case of anti-globalization or alter globalization, it's absolutely true that this is where the repertoire of contention comes together. This is even a direct lineage in the case of the Brazilian Free-Fair movement. Many of them worked at Indie Media Brazil. This was the line of transmission was quite clear. But again, it's a very quick prehistory, so I could explain that these elements were picked from elsewhere. In the case of the 1960s, the same answer holds. We knew going in that the selection of Todd Gitlin as the major voice from SDS was going to annoy some people that knew quite a lot about the 1960s, and it did. But the reason for that narrative was because he went through something or described something which was oddly reminiscent of what the MPL went through in 2013, and this is something that I discussed with them in 2013. So again, the selection was, it's a prehistory, and that explains the selection. I could have done a lot more on the 60s or nothing at all. I went for the middle. Went for the middle ground. But my kind of feeling is that a lot of writing has been done on the positive effects of the 60s. So I just wanted to stick to the parts that ended up mattering for the 2010s. The second question, which is, if I remember correctly, how is the conclusion of the final two chapters different from a straightforward Leninist critique? Is that right? Yes. Yeah. So again, the book is journalistic, so I really try not to do too much myself. I pick this sort of middle ground between making no conclusions and actually like coming up with a program for a given revolution in a given country or something like that. I decide not to do that for a couple of reasons. One, I hope that the book is written for a global audience and it will be read in different countries and people will come to different conclusions based on local conditions in that country. And also it is journalistic. So what I'm doing really in the final two chapters is summarizing 200 to 250 interviews. Now, to come up with to sort and categorize all of those 250 answers, I come up with a very, very schematized and simplified spectrum, where on the one hand, you have all these elements that I described at the beginning: full spontaneity, full leaderlessness, full horizontality. And again, this is a historically emerging category. Like there's no reason necessarily for these things to go together, but in the case of the 2010s, it makes sense to put this side of the spectrum, those elements on this side of the spectrum. And on the other side of the spectrum would be Leninism. And what I talk about, the elements that I'm really talking about, as I discussed at the very beginning of the book, from Leninism, or something like democratic centralism, a focus on state power, and a belief in transformation of existing institutions with, a strong revolutionary theory. Now, some of the people that I spoke to stayed in the same place, but this was not the majority of people. A lot of people moved on this spectrum. So some people came around to what I might categorize as a kind of common sense anti-Leninism, which can be expressed by saying, we can't throw out tools that work just because they're associated with the Soviet Union. We can't be, just because we didn't like the way things went in Russia or other states that pretend themselves to be socialists around the world, doesn't mean we can throw out everything that works because the tools that work are necessary in a battle with enemies. Now, other people in the interviews that I do come around to revisiting the historical Lenin, saying, you should read Lenin. Nobody said, it's not that I can remember. Nobody said we should rerun the 1917 Bolshevik Revolution, right? Read Lenin in 2024. Nunes and Tuyal, who's I put on the board, they both come up with something which is, again, on the spectrum. It's not all the way back. Interestingly, they both come up with some kind of a fusion between autonomous urges and the necessity for some kind of representation and leadership. Nunes coming up with network Leninism in his book, Neither Vertical or Horizontal. And Tuyal at Berkeley, something he calls 21st century Bolshevism. Nunes is like more prominent in the end of the book. Again, these are narrative choices. These are also refers to Alex's questions or critiques. He's more central because he's in the whole story, right? So the book tries to be narratively coherent. So the solution varies from person to person, I think from country to country. I gesture in a really broad way at organizations, and which of those already exist or which can be built, I think that varies radically based on whether or not we're talking about Somalia or the United Kingdom. But, briefly, those organizations might be parliamentary parties, revolutionary parties, social movements, unions, things like that. So that's how I try to summarize kind of the final critique. But the real core elements of what seemed to have been missing in key moments were already put forward in the top, which is a pre-existing organization or a group of people that were ready and willing to take advantage of an unexpected opportunity and get the assent of the people while doing so, which is the important part, right? Like you always want to be, you're not really a vanguard if no one's following you, right? Okay, and then the main part of the next question that I remember most clearly is whether or not we should make an analytical distinction between mediation and the movement itself. Is that right? Where are we? Is he still here? Oh yeah, there you are. So right. So briefly was the first part of the question. Say it again. Oh yeah. So you're right. So the most eloquent theorists of horizontality or horizontalism do say it's not about what I perhaps in the book set up as a criterion for success or failure. The most eloquent exponents, theorists of horizontalism do say that no, it's not about the ends, it's about the means, it's about changing, it's about experimentation, it's about different types of structures. Again, I see no problem with that whatsoever. What this book is about is protests that accidentally get so large or unexpectedly get so large that they become something else. And then in that case, a lot of other people have a different idea of what could be the final outcome. That then you get a situation where, well, there's going to be a change now. What kind of change is it going to be? The decision as to whether or not this is going to be something good or bad, whether or not it's going to be success or failure, is going to be imposed on you because material conditions of all the people in this country are now different because of this explosion. So I agree with you. And this is one of the strange, and this is why I'm not sort of trying to be like, well, this whole set of theoretical interventions needs to be thrown out because it wasn't this package wasn't put together to do that. It just accidentally got so many people on the streets that it was doing that, which is a strange paradox in the book. My answer, I think, comes from a similar place on the question of separating mediation from the thing itself. That can be done and should be done in everything but protests. Because a protest is itself, in my view, my fundamental approach to protesting is that protesting is a communicative act. So if you don't have any control over how it's going to be represented, if you have no way to say, this is what we're doing or this is what we're not doing, then there's a big problem. Now, if you are building actual working class power in a given neighborhood, and it doesn't matter what the media say because you actually have real structural power, that's a different situation. If you win an election, even with the media lying about you, well, then you can separate mediation. But protest, I think, is fundamentally always communicative, which is why I don't separate those two phenomena. I do think it makes a lot of sense to separate other political phenomena from mediation. Oh yeah, this is really interesting. So this is really, I mean, I'm from California. So the next question is like, I'm from the global center of like post-left woo-woo mysticism that becomes the alt-right, right? Like this is like really my territory. This is something that's absolutely real. The way to dodge the question is that I don't analyze any US movements in the book, but it's like, this is something that really happens. Naomi Klein's book actually goes into this quite a lot and studies very carefully. And then interestingly, her book and mine are both about this. The book is Doppelganger. She ends up spending a bunch of time on like understanding why people are pulled to the anti-vax alt-right, people that she used to think were reasonable or seemed to be reasonable before. And interestingly, we talked about this in About Needed together. Both of our books end up being about vacuums. I'm talking about power vacuums. Her book is about narrative vacuum. And what she says is that, well, when things are obviously wrong, there's certainly clearly some kind of miscommunication going on. Or in the case of a pandemic, it's just fundamentally impossible to understand. There's a narrative vacuum, and nature affords a vacuum. In the case of my episodes, you have powerful organized groups filling a power vacuum. In the case of the phenomenon that Naomi Klein analyzes, you have narrative vacuums being filled by whoever will just say the thing that goes viral. And this is a big problem, but it is a real one. So like it's sociologically, empirically, I think it is provable if you wanted to do a study of people that were at Occupy Wall Street. Some of them are going to be on the anti-vax assault right now. I think that's pretty well understood. And yeah, your final question is something that I'm glad you pointed me back to. It's a major thing in the book. I didn't talk about it too much here. But often a lot of these this package, the one that I'm forgetting your name now, there's the populism. This package, as you rightly pointed out, was put together not as a project to transform state power. It was also not put together meant to withstand imperialist counterattack, right? Again, this is an opportunity that was not planned for because it was like nobody thought when David Gray was writing The New Anarchists and the Electric Review in 2001 that like this package that comes together in the Alter Globalization movement is going to put millions and millions of people on the street and topple governments around the world. But this is a contradiction that becomes clear again. Like my first book is really about the construction of an imperialist global system. And in the second book, often people are shocked to see it appearing on the horizon at the absolute worst moment. It's like, oh, there is the United States that will crush a movement that it sees as a threat. Saudi Arabia will march over the bridge and crush the Bahraini uprising. And so I'm glad you pointed us back to that question. The question of understanding, again, I wish it wasn't there. We can't wish ourselves out of it. Understanding the nature of the global system, I think is important for any project that does want to do more than say, change discursive practices or experiment with new organizational forms, which again, I think that there's no problem with. I see no problem with organizing a workplace or a living space according, experimenting with organizational forms in that sense. But when it comes to replacing a government with a different government, neighbors and the hegemon are usually going to have an opinion. So that is something that has to be understood well in advance.
Thank you. I think maybe we can. You're good. You want more questions?
Okay.
So, are there more questions? Anyone else? Yes, some timid hands. Yeah, 1, 2. Okay, come over, please. From home, feel free to switch on your cameras if you want to feel part of it. I think we will finish by 6 or 10 past 6.
2 questions?
I think so, yes.
Okay.
Unless Nathan or Diego also want to ask a question. Diego, you only have organized. Come on. Okay. What's your name?
I'm Dan. I'm doing a PhD at LSE in the sociology department. I guess I just had like 2 things. One was just a quick, I think the Syrian case is really interesting because that idea of the vacuum, you also see obviously different neighboring powers, the US, Russia, but also in the Kurdish region, you have the Kurdish movement as an organized leftist movement, kind of steps into that part of Syria. And then my other question was more thinking about Gezi, and when I talked to people in Turkey who were involved in it, and it was this big political moment, it feels like then the trajectory of the way the Erdogan regime responds for the next coming years is to shut down as many different potential new Gezi. So I'm kind of wondering what are these responses of states or hegemonic powers? They're seeing that these protest tactics are effective and they're spreading, and how are they shifting their response to react to do the kind of counter revolution you were talking?
Great.
Thank you. Yes, please come. And I'll also calling John Narayan from home, who's also one of the organizers, even if he's walking his daughter. Okay, go ahead.
Hi, my name is Samira. I just wanted to ask briefly, your thoughts on this current moment, post-October 7th, as someone who has studied mass protests, looking at our utter inability through mass sustained protests and organizing to get both specifically the US and the UK to call for a ceasefire. It seems like with the 2010s, all the examples you gave, uprisings led to some sort of breakthrough, and then the quote unquote failure came from what happened after in the vacuums. But here in 2023, beginning of 24, we've had over 100 days of a live streamed genocide, and all popular efforts have kind of proved ineffective. And just want to know your thoughts.
Thank you.
I'll do those 2 and see how we're on time.
John, do you want to come in, your last chance? Yeah. Okay, go ahead.
Okay. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
So thank you, Vincent, for that great talk. Sorry I can't be there today. I kind of want to dovetail on that last question because it kind of gets to the question I'm getting at, which is So we had this decade of protests and the inability essentially to create state revolution. Yet in some ways, that has led to the emergence of a, how does that relate now down to this decade where the interstate system does seem to be somewhat anti-imperialist, but without the democratic overtures of that past decade, right? So what's happening in Palestine is a really good example where you have an interesting dialectic where one of the, a nation state such as South Africa, which has one of the highest Gini coefficients in the world, has massive structural problems with democracy itself, but is leading a sort of anti-imperialist charge against what the previous speakers called, the live streaming of genocide. So how do you see this decade's relationship with the decade you map out so well in the book? How does that, how does the anti-imperialist movement, because that's the kind of word that we've been avoiding, but that's what we want. How does that match up with that past decade? How does the events of what's happening in, yeah, exactly, map up with what's happening now? I hope you can get that question as I'm child caring at the same time.
Okay. Thanks, John. And Lila, of course.
Amazing. So the first question is about both Syria and Gezi Park. And I think that the events are very, very different, but in a strange way, they can be answered with reference to a dynamic, which I didn't get to in the main talk. By 2012, 2013, especially after the death of Gaddafi, which is like a snuff film we broadcast on YouTube, right? It becomes clear to leaders that, as Hassam says, he gestures that at the beginning, and I'm really glad that he brought up 2 points that I didn't put in the talk, because I knew he was going to talk. You can get a whole lot of people in the square. You can even get a majority of the country wanting the government to fall. But if you have the military on your side, you can just crush them, you can kill them. If you have the support of security services, this is an old revolutionary truism, either you beat the military in a civil war or you have defections. If you keep the military on your side, you can just kill everyone in the square. And this is something that becomes tragically clear in the 2010s, especially when after it becomes clear that what happened to Gaddafi could happen to other leaders. This is a move that's available, and it always is. Well, it was a little bit optimistic to think that just because the people showed we want a better life, that the leader would have to give into it. If this were the case, if we lived in that kind of a system, there'd be no reason to protest in the first place. Another thing you can do is just nothing, and this is what happens eventually in Hong Kong. Gezi Park, there's evidence that I really recommend Jian Tuyal's book on Gezi Park and its aftermath, because he points to the ways that it did lead to, paradoxically, indirectly entrenched authoritarianism. The name of the book is The Fall of the Turkish Model. But there is evidence that there was an attempt to kind of come up with a set of solutions to the demands that were being presented by the park, but they couldn't come up with one. And so you can just do nothing. And this is another thing that becomes clear tragically throughout the decade. So the importance of not just the symbolic and the communicative aspect of the demonstration, but also putting real pressure on the things that matter to decision makers is going to be a way to lead into this answer to the second question. But Hassam talked about this briefly, but I didn't talk about the book. In all of the cases that you would consider more successful than the others, you did have some kind of organized labor making it impossible for the economy to proceed at the pace that leaders really cared about. Because leaders care about. Leaders in the capitalist economy, leaders in the capitalist state, they might be able to put up with a certain amount of people in the square, especially if they can lie about them, especially if they can say, oh, they're all backed by some foreign power. Sometimes they might be backed by a foreign power, so it's half true anyways. So, but if you actually take away things that leaders care about, then you're much more likely to succeed. Now, in the case of the Palestine protests, that dynamic, I think, matters quite a lot. So one of the strange things about the 2010s is that the protests did actually do something, right? I grew up in an era in which we would protest and we kind of sort of assumed that they weren't going to do anything. I protested the invasion of Iraq in 2003, perpetrated by my government, and the exception of this government. But what happened was the decision makers, the people that really, really mattered, decided they didn't care. They just ignored it. Now, in the case of what's happening to the people of Palestine, it is really Netanyahu and Joe Biden that matter. These are the decision makers, whose incentive structures, whose concrete material reality has to be threatened or changed, apparently, for things to take a different path. So on the one hand, I see the huge wave of pro-Palestine protests as an important thing that I take part in. I think that it's getting a message out that a huge part of the world's population is against what's happening to the people of Palestine. It can help to bring people together and organize in concrete ways, but it's still kind of, at least for now, in that older category of the types of communicative events whose message can't be ignored by, unfortunately, tragically, by the people who really make the decisions. And the case of Israel is very special because Israel has built into its philosophy, especially in Netanyahu's party, the idea that the whole world is against us anyway. So this can kind of prove that we need to be more like we are. So, but I do, as I say in the conclusion of the book, that the 2020s may end up being more of a mass protest decade than the 2010s were. And so we don't know where this is going to go. But I think at least for now, the pro-Palestine protests, and this is not a judgment or quality, a normative analysis, but I wouldn't slot them into the very specific type of phenomenon that I analyze in the book, in that they haven't unseated or fundamentally destabilized any existing governments. And then the final question is a very good one about the necessarily imperfect nature of the states that are in some way pushing back against the dominant hegemonic powers. So politically, personally, I'm always mentally in Brazil. I've been living in Sao Paulo for most of the last 15 years. The BRICS for a very long time were seen as the beginnings of this building block of something like perhaps, the most optimistic analysis, the beginnings of something like a new third world movement, the beginnings of an attempt to restructure the global economy. But then what happens in the last 6 months is you get reactionary Gulf monarchies brought into this bloc. That is the nature, I think, of geopolitics. You have to play with the cards that are in the deck. I know that doesn't mean that we should lie about the nature of the governments that are picking sides. I think that's just the way it is. And I think in pointing to the contradictions here, South Africa has played a hugely important role, I think, in the legal world over the last few weeks. That doesn't mean that everything that we must pretend or that they need to be, that we need to say that everything's perfect domestically. When you're dealing with geopolitics, at least in the current global system that we have, you're dealing with states, all of whom are imperfect. As I said in the conclusion to the book, in any state in the global system right now, if you do the wrong thing, you can get a police officer to use violence against you. That is built into every single one of the states that I can think of right now. But when we're dealing with alliances at the geopolitical level, we're dealing inevitably with those states. And if an imperfection is a contradiction, that is real, but must also that we must deal with, but we must also face clearly while dealing with it. So thank you for that question. And I thank everyone for putting up with this for 2 hours. I think we're good now, but I truly thank you for the attention and
Thanks so much, everyone. Just a quick point. We actually recorded the meeting, and given the mess at the beginning, we didn't ask the people who intervened. Are you happy if we share it, or you prefer we don't share the Q&A? So if you have any concern, just talk to me now, and we can edit it out, or,
If anyone's on camera doesn't want to be on there, I'm not even sure it's going to go, but if anyone's on camera.
You did well, though, so you did well, so maybe we share it. Okay, thanks everyone, also from home. See you soon.